Well, good morning, everyone. My name's Darren, and I'm the newest addition to our ministry team, which I'm very excited about. I just wanted to start off by saying thank you for the messages that I've had this week and for your kind words, and also thank you to those who've volunteered already. We're starting a new team at One, storytelling team, people who are interested in using different types of media, podcasting, written word, photography, video, to tell stories from within our community to encourage one another. And so if that's you, if you're interested in that, I'd love to chat with you and talk to you about how we might do that. One of the things that we are going to be doing is starting a new blog. We still haven't quite got our name settled for this, but this will be a blog that Tim will predominantly run, and it's going to be based upon your questions. So questions about faith, spirituality, culture, anything that you think Tim might have an interesting perspective on. Don't ask logistical questions. I'm not sure Tim's the best person to ask those to. Just something I've picked up in the last couple of weeks. But anything that you think you would have an interesting perspective on. We can't guarantee every question will be answered on the blog, but those questions will shape other things that we do as a ministry team as well, perhaps small group resources, sermon series, those types of things. So if you've got an interesting question, please do feel free to pop it in there. You can leave your name or not, it's up to you. And we'll promote this over the coming weeks as well. So, yeah, looking forward to hearing those questions that you've got. Make them tricky. So we are doing a little mini-series at the moment on making disciples. And today we're finishing this series, and it's in the lead up to our Alpha course. I've really enjoyed the preceding 2 weeks, and I encourage you to dig into those if you haven't already on our YouTube account, on our podcast. But today I'm going to finish up this series, and we're going to build upon the passage that we looked at last week from Matthew 10. Tim did the first 32 verses of chapter 10, and he's given me the last 10 verses, which doesn't sound like much at all. But as I've been preparing, I've realised there's at least 5 sermons that I could give on these 10 verses. So hold on to your seats. Pray that God will just help me to pass over the bits he doesn't want me to say. But there's a lot of really good stuff in these 10 verses. The context is that Jesus is sending out his 12 disciples. They've been watching him preach. They've been watching him heal. They've been watching him touch the untouchable, cast out demons. They've been watching the reactions of people to these things as well. And now he is saying to them, I want you to go and do likewise. Before we get into the passage, I want you to just take a moment to try and imagine how the disciples were feeling in this moment. They've just seen him do all these things, and now he says, to this point, you've just been following me around watching, and now I want you to do. I want you to do what I'm doing. He's inviting them into the things that they've seen him do. I don't know about you, but I think I would be terrified at this moment. I can remember, and I've told this story before, that moment where I went to youth group one Friday night and my youth pastor said, tonight we're going door knocking. I was 14. I had no preparation, although I'd been a Christian for a number of years, and I remember that jolt of terror that went through me. Firstly, about what I would say, whether I would have the words, whether I would freeze, whether I would meet someone from school, and what people's reactions would be. All kinds of fear and doubts and uncertainty went through my mind. And I can kind of imagine the disciples feeling that mixture of feelings as well. Perhaps some excitement, but also doubt of their own ability and worry about what people would say. They'd seen people react to Jesus in all kinds of different ways. Imagine how they were feeling. As we think about making disciples, as we think about making invitations to Alpha, I'm sure you feel that same sort of mix of feelings. And I want to encourage us to listen to the words of Jesus that he says to us today. And hopefully he says something for you that will inspire you to live a more public faith. So we're going to take it 2 verses at a time. maybe 3 or 4 if we get a little further on. So he starts off by saying this: "Whoever acknowledges me before others, I will also acknowledge before my Father in heaven. But whoever disowns me before others, I will disown before my Father in heaven." There's a lot we could pull out of these verses, but the word that really leapt off the page at me over the last couple of weeks is this word acknowledges. I wanted to know a little bit more about what that word is. So I kind of did a little bit of research. Some translations say confesses, the one who confesses me before others. If you look at the Greek word, it's homologous, maybe, and it means one word, or to be of one word. So Jesus says, if you are of one word with me, if you are in voiced agreement with me before others, I will be in voiced agreement with you before the Father. I will confess you before the Father. There's a lot going on here. The other part of it is that he says, I want you to be in voiced agreement with me before others. This is a public thing. What I think is happening here is that Jesus is sort of addressing this shift that's happening in the disciples. That to this point, they've been passive to a point. They've been following, they've been observing. And he's saying, your discipleship is changing here. I want your discipleship not just to be a following of me, watching of me, but I want to invite you into doing what I do. It's a participation with him, which is quite a remarkable thing. Jesus says, I want you to do what I do. They are going from having a private discipleship to a public one. And along with that comes all kinds of worries and concerns and uncertainties and doubts, no doubt. But what he's doing here is he's actually shifting them off those uncertainties and fears, and he's actually shifting them to heaven. He says, when you confess me before others, when you are in voiced agreement with me, before other people, I will be in voiced agreement with you in heaven. I think what he's doing is he's shifting their attention to the bigger picture and to take them away from some of that terror perhaps that they're feeling. He says, when you acknowledge me before others, I'll acknowledge you before the Father. And I don't completely understand what's going on here. It's a kind of a mysterious sort of a statement that he's making. But I think that's quite a remarkable thing. You know, when Claire's friend confessed Jesus and invited her along to Alpha, her friend was being confessed to the Father by Jesus. Jesus was talking to the Father about her. When Claire invited her friends to Alpha, when she publicly acknowledged Jesus, she was being talked about by Jesus to the Father. Something quite mysterious and remarkable going on there, which I think is a beautiful thing. So my first question today is, are we in voiced agreement with Jesus? Are you in voiced agreement with Jesus? And I suspect there'll be a variety of answers in the room today. Perhaps some of you don't really know if you're in voiced agreement with Jesus because you don't really know enough about Jesus. If that's you, you're in the right place today because we've got this course starting in 2 days' time, which is designed specifically to answer that question, to introduce you to the person of Jesus. And I highly recommend doing it. Perhaps some of you were in voiced agreement with Jesus, but you've kind of just been drifting a little. Maybe your faith has become a secondary to you. I can relate to that. And I want to encourage you to do Alpha as well. I did Alpha when I was 20 years old. I'd been away from church for a year or two. I knew a lot about Jesus. I'd been in voiced agreement with him in the past, but I'd kind of drifted. And a friend invited me to do Alpha, and it changed my life. Alpha's not just for people who don't know anything about faith. It's something that can bring a lot of life to your faith too. So I encourage you to consider it as well. Or maybe your answer is that you're in agreement with Jesus, but you've been leading a kind of a private discipleship experience, and you haven't actually voiced that agreement. You haven't actually confessed Jesus before workmates or family or friends. Maybe Jesus is actually prompting you today to go more public in your faith. Maybe he's been prompting you to have that conversation with that friend about Alpha. I want to encourage you to lean into that today, to take that step out of your comfort zone, to make that invitation, to have those conversations. Let's dig into the next few verses here. These are quite confronting ones. I almost wanted to skip over these today because they're kind of hard verses, but I think they're really important, particularly as we think about this context of going and making disciples. Jesus says, "Do not suppose that I have come to bring peace on earth. I didn't come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to turn," and here he's quoting Micah the prophet, "I've come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his own household. Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." What do we make of this? I have not come to bring peace to earth. This is someone who, one of his names is Prince of Peace. This is someone who preached, "Blessed are the peacemakers. Turn the other cheek. Love your enemies." This is someone who, in amongst his last words were, "My peace I leave you." Jesus is someone who talked a lot about peace. He was obviously interested in peace. So what is going on here? We've got to remember that these verses here are said in the context of him sending his disciples out to preach the good news and to touch the untouchable and to heal the sick. I think what he's talking about here is the reaction that his disciples are going to get when they go out. The sword that he talks about here is the division about how people will respond to the gospel. And this has certainly been true already in the ministry of Jesus. People have either been intrigued by him and followed him and gone after him, and others have reacted against him, sometimes quite hostile in their reactions. And certainly this is going to be the case for the disciples as well. Tim talked last week about earlier in this passage, Jesus said to the disciples that some of them would get arrested. Some of them would be whipped and flogged as a result of what they did. There's going to be a reaction. Some people will be intrigued. Some people will want more. They will follow Jesus. And some people will reject Jesus, whether that be in a passive kind of ignoring kind of way or a more of a hostile way. There's no kind of warm, cozy message here, unfortunately. Jesus doesn't come to make our life cozy. That's the way the message translates to this passage. He's come to divide. And sometimes those divisions will happen in our closest relationships. The other thing that I think maybe is being said here, particularly in that last verse, is that Jesus is actually talking about the kind of relationship that he wants with us. He says, "Anyone who loves their father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. Anyone who loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me." I don't think here he's saying that we need to love our family any less or take a sword to our family and try and divide our family. He's certainly not saying that. That's not biblical. What he's saying here is that he wants something greater than that. I don't know about you, but as I think about the closest human relationships that I have, they almost all are within my family. I can't imagine loving anyone more than my wife or my boys. I still remember that moment where I held my boys for the first time and looked into their eyes. That love was a physical love. I can't imagine loving them more. That's the closest kind of love that we can experience between human to human. And yet, Jesus says, "I want you to love me more." Remember in John 15, he says, "I am the vine and you are the branches." That's a different kind of connection. He says, "Dwell in me, abide in me, make your life in me, and I will make my life in you." That's a whole other level of intimacy. Jesus isn't devaluing family here. He's increasing the value and the intimacy that he wants to have with us. And I think it's really important for us to keep this in mind as we go, as we make disciples. Firstly, we need to have that kind of relationship with him. We need to be fostering that mutual dwelling, but it's also what we are introducing people into. And for me, that's really encouraging as I deal with my own fears and insecurities about having those sorts of conversations, to realise that those conversations may well lead to someone having an incredible life-altering experience. Let's keep going through this passage. We're only halfway, sorry. Whoever does not take up their cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. The disciples heard this verse very differently to the way we hear it. We have hindsight. We know that Jesus died on a cross. We know that the cross has become a symbol of forgiveness and redemption. The disciples didn't understand that. For them, a cross was a confronting, violent illustration. A cross was a tool of execution that the Romans used to remove anyone who didn't pledge allegiance to them. In the year 4 BC, the Romans had crucified 2,000 Jews as a result of a rebellion or an attempted rebellion. They had lined 2,000 crosses up from one side of Galilee and crucified 2,000 Jews. So these disciples knew what a cross was. It equated to death. And Jesus here is equating discipleship with carrying a cross. You didn't carry a cross unless you were on your way to a public, shameful death. This is not how we tend to interpret this verse. But Jesus here is saying to his disciples, this call I'm inviting you into is a life-altering call. He's equating it with a death. Now, hopefully, that's not going to happen to anyone in the room today, although it still does happen today. What does it mean for us today? All kinds of things, really. Your cross is going to be different to my cross, perhaps, but I think there's some truth in this with what we talked about last week. It's interesting, last week in the passage, Jesus said to his disciples not to take anything with them. He said, don't take a bag, don't take an extra cloak, a staff, don't take extra sandals, don't take any money, travel light. Remove those things that are going to make your life heavy. And Tim did a great job last week of talking about how this is a really countercultural teaching for us today. Jesus says, don't take anything with you, but this week he says, carry your cross. I think that's kind of an interesting kind of thing going on there. Don't take anything with you. The New Living Translation says this: if you cling to your life, you will lose it. What I feel like God's been saying to me as I've pondered these verses this week is that there's all these things in my life that I cling to. The world says if I want to have life, I need to be successful, I need to have a good career, my family needs to be a certain way, I need to have enough things, I need to have enough money when I retire, I need to be secure, I need to have enough pleasure, need to have enough experiences. If I have all these things and I gather all these things together, I will have a great life. I don't know about you, but sometimes it feels like the more I grab onto things, the less life I have. Jesus says something paradoxical here. He says, let go. Let go. Don't cling to these things. Actually, follow me. Take up your cross and follow me. And that's when you'll find life. Jesus said, I have come to give you a life, abundant life. But that means giving up things. That means letting go of things. That means dying to my own ambitions, my own direction. This is teaching that is hard. There's a real tension here. I think this is teaching that takes a whole lifetime to unpack. If you feel that tension, welcome to the club. We all do. It's a constant lesson of letting go. Okay, we're going to get into the last verses here. Thanks, Tim, for this. There's a lot in this passage. Anyone who welcomes you welcomes me. And anyone who welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. Again, something is happening here between what's happening on earth and what's happening in heaven, like it did at the start. Jesus says, if you are welcomed, I am welcomed, and the Father is welcomed. Whoever welcomes a prophet as a prophet will receive a prophet's reward, and whoever welcomes a righteous person as a righteous person will receive a righteous person's reward. I think that could probably do with a bit of an edit. It feels like there's a lot of repetition going on there, isn't there? And if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to one of these little ones who is my disciple, truly I tell you, that person will certainly not lose their reward. What's going on here? Firstly, there's a lot of welcoming going on. Jesus is talking about the disciples being welcomed, but there's also a sense here where there's a call to welcome as well. It seems to go in both directions. I think there's something in this as well. As we think about welcome, and we try and be a welcoming church, we try and be a hospitable church. I think that's definitely a biblical thing. But I wonder whether we also need to be a church who receives hospitality. Jesus was hospitable, but he was on the receiving end of hospitality more than he was hospitable. And I wonder whether there's something in this as we think about making disciples, whether we need to be also not just willing to be hospitable to the people who come to us, but we need to also be willing to go into the places where other people can be hospitable to us. That's a whole sermon that we could probably unpack a little bit as we look at the way Jesus did his ministry. We need to be on the receiving end of welcome and hospitality, as well as being that type of person as well. It's interesting here to see the three people who we are to welcome. We're to welcome the prophet, the righteous person, and the little ones. I wonder whether sometimes it's easier to welcome some people than others, the people who deserve to be welcomed, the people who are like us. Jesus seems to be quite inclusive here as he thinks about the different types of people that we welcome. Again, something that we could unpack. But I want to focus in just on this last little bit. This is how Jesus sums up his whole teaching, the whole of chapter 10. If you go back and reread the chapter 10 of Matthew, you will see that Jesus has covered a lot of ground. He has predicted that the disciples will be arrested and flogged, that people will reject them, that people will hate them. He's talked about the mirroring of what we confess here on earth is confessed in heaven as well. There's a lot of things going on, and I can imagine the disciples, as they're about to get sent out, are feeling all kinds of stuff. Making disciples can be big. It can be overwhelming. It can feel too big. But Jesus brings it back to something really simple. He says, and if anyone gives even a cup of cold water to these little ones, this act of giving a cup of cold water, giving a cup of water is something anyone can do. Anyone can do it. It's a simple act, yet it's a life-changing act to someone who is thirsty. And I wonder whether today, as we think about those conversations that maybe God's prompting us to have, whether we need to just step back and not look at the bigness of it and just realize that it's just asking a simple question. It's just giving a cup of water. It's just having a simple conversation. What are we going to do with all this? I don't know. We've covered a lot of ground today. But I do wonder whether maybe God's speaking to us as individuals and as a community as we think about making disciples. Are we willing to confess him before others? Are we willing to have those conversations? Are we willing to give a cup of water, something simple? Are we willing to meet a need in the life of those around us? I'm going to invite the band to come up and just wonder if we might have a moment of quiet just to ponder the things that we've talked about this morning, to allow God to direct our minds, and just to respond to what you feel like God's been saying this morning to you. Just take a moment. Are you in voiced agreement with him? Is your discipleship a private thing or a public thing? What are you clinging on to? Who might God be calling you to give a cup of water to? Lord God, we thank you for this passage. We thank you for the challenges in it. If we're honest about it, perhaps there's tension that we feel as a result of hearing these things. Lord God, I just pray that you would help us to step back from those feelings of fear and uncertainty and doubt that maybe comes with the idea of making disciples. Help us to see the big picture. Oh God, help us to realise that these simple conversations that we might have the potential to bring life, abundant life to those around us. Lord God, I thank you for the interview we heard this morning and how an invitation of a friend changed one life and then that changed other lives, and the ripples of your message going out into other communities. We thank you for the confession of that friend. Help us to be a part of this in the lives of those around us also. Amen.